Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to see Hershey Dwoskin on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon. I just have to make a few announcements. So this Friday, we have Marty Supreme that will be playing here. It is Friday afternoon at the movies at 2 o'clock. The movie is 2 hours and a half. It is in English with English subtitles. Then on Tuesday, we have Gail Cohen for her Bright Lights. The movie is called The Room Next Door. It is in English with English subtitles, and it's 107 minutes. There will be Gail will like introduce the movie, then you'll watch the movie, and then there'll be a discussion after the movie if you would like to stay and have and discuss the movie that you watched. Then on Thursday, we have the outdoor concert that is supposed to be on Trudeau Park. Now, we will decide the day of if the concert will be indoors or outside. It will really depend on the weather. We will be giving out rain passes 2 days before. So on Tuesday morning, we will be giving out 2 rain passes per person to see the concert if it's going to be indoors. If you do not have a rain pass, you will not be able to come into the auditorium if it is indeed inside. And that's it. Thank you. Yes. No, that's next week, the week after. The week after, it's on August 4th. Next week is July 28th.
Thank you, Angela. Hi, everybody. Whoa, now this microphone is really good and loud. I love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. So, hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I want to speak today, and I was requested, and I said I would speak last time about Africa because I was there for a month and I got back about a month ago. But I just have to speak about this new announcement of Trump about a new tariffs on Canada. And just to review a little bit, he has announced tariffs on Canada before. Tariffs have been in place since Trump made his first attempt to put tariffs on Canada. I just how has that affected us as a country, and what should our response be to this? And what's with the whole tariff situation? So we know what the tariffs are, right? A tariff is a tax that is paid by the importer of something in order to make that good more expensive in the United States, so that if it's expensive enough, people will stop importing those things and make them by themselves in the US. In theory, that's the reason for a tariff. Obviously, one of the results of a tariff is that whatever is imported costs more because you're adding this tax right onto the cost of the goods that you're paying for to come in. So we know by now, because we've had enough time, we've had 2 years to look at this, the cost of the inflation rate, or the rise in the cost of living in Canada and in the US, are very different, because we don't have as many tariffs on our imports as the US has on their imports. Practically speaking, the US is tariffing every single import that comes into the country. And I don't know if you saw this, I just caught this at noontime. Trump just announced, believe this or not, shock of shocks, 100% tariff on all imported generic drugs to the United States. Now, why in the world would you want to make medicine more expensive for people who need it? There are a lot of generic drugs made outside the US. For example, in Israel, that's one country that's a huge producer of generic drugs. The Teva Corporation, TEVA, they are a big manufacturer of generic drugs, and they sell them all around the world. The biggest manufacturer of generic drugs in the world is India, and they account for probably half of all the generic drugs produced in the whole world, and they sell their drugs to everybody. And you have to remember that sometimes a generic drug is not the end in itself. It's an ingredient to make other generic drugs. In other words, mixing a couple of different drugs together, you get a new product. So why pick on generic drugs to put 100% tariff on? It's just completely insensible. That just doesn't make any sense at all. It's not as if you can say, oh, you know what? I'm going to open up a generic drug factory like in 2 weeks. It's not the same thing as opening a lumber mill. You know, generic drugs require a lot of science, a lot of laboratories, a lot of testing, a lot of knowledge, a lot of everything. It's everything coming together. So how he picks this particular item, God only knows. Now, we know that Canada and the US and Mexico are part of this North American Free Trade Agreement, which Trump had signed in his first term in 2018 and called it the best deal ever. Now the same agreement he's calling the worst deal ever. And he made a formal announcement that the United States is going to withdraw completely from that agreement. Unfortunately for him, the announcement that you make, there's a 10-year window. So you give the notice today and it only goes into effect in 10 years. Hopefully by 10 years, Trump will maybe pick a new job for himself, but he won't be president, that's for sure. Has Canada suffered because of the tariffs? That's the question. What's the answer? Absolutely. Absolutely. The areas where the suffering is greatest in Canada are in the car industry, the lumber industry, and the aluminum industry. Those three industries, the aluminum industry is based in Quebec, the car industry is based in Ontario, and the lumber industry is mostly based in British Columbia, but pretty well many provinces have a lumber industry. And I was reading recently in BC, one of the big companies just shut down 2 sawmills because of, lack of demand. Now, the United States has their own lumber industry, that's for sure. Are they able to produce enough lumber to meet all their needs without Canada? Absolutely not. So by him putting tariffs on Canadian lumber, it raises the cost of house building, it raises the cost of renovations, it raises the cost of anything that you need wood for. And the new announcements that he just made today, or yesterday, was he was going to put a 50% tariff on Canadian particle board. You know what that stuff is? It's like cheap plywood. Where do you think that's made? A lot of it is made here in Quebec. Particle board, more lumber, and more some other wood product that I can't, pulp, I think it was. So he's really, really trying to push Canada down. His other big complaint, of course, was that 8 provinces took American liquor off their shelves. Now, why did they do that? Because he put tariffs on Canada in the first place. And they said, well, why should we sell American liquor when they put tariffs on us? And now Trump says, wait a minute, you're taking our liquor off their shelves. We have to put more tariffs on you. The answer is to take off the first tariffs. That would be the logical thing to do. But no, he wants to put more tariffs on. The American liquor industry has lost somewhere close to $1 billion of Canadian sales since the tariffs went on. And obviously they feel it. And Trump wants to bully his way to get the liquor boards to put back the liquor on the shelves. Now, remember, in most provinces in Canada, 8 out of 10, the liquor commissions are government owned, like in Quebec, right? So the government does all the buying of all the liquor in the whole province, and then it distributes it either in its own stores or it sells it to Provigo and then, all those other places for wine and beer and stuff like that. So he also put a tariff on Canadian beer, by the way. which Americans don't drink anymore. It used to be, by the way, in case you may remember, Canadian beer used to be the biggest selling foreign beer in the US. That was like 30 years ago. By now, it's Mexican beer, and the Mexican beer is so popular in the US that the number one beer selling brand in the US, number one, up until Trump's crap, was the Modelo beer, made the same company that makes Corona beer. So it goes to show that people's tastes change, and Canadian beer has been absent from American supermarkets for a long time. If you ever went to an American supermarket in the old days, you would always see Molson's and Labatt's beer was there, but not anymore. So he's putting these extra tariffs on just to put pressure on Canada. Part of the reason is that this free trade agreement, which he just pulled out of, is supposed to be renegotiated. And what he would like to do is to have his conditions that he started with put into the agreement, so that once the Canadians and Mexicans agree to his terms, then they can't be changed. So that's why he's saying, in case a new agreement is ever signed, I want all these tariffs in place in the agreement itself. So that's his thinking, that's his strategy. But needless to say, America has lost far, far, far more money by Canadians not shopping in the States, by not traveling to the States, by not buying American things, than he's made in tariffs charging to Canadian companies, charging for Canadian imports. So remember, it's not Canadian companies that pay the tariffs. It's the American importers that pay the tariffs. So in some cases, the Canadian companies may reduce their price a little bit in order to compete better, but very often it doesn't happen that way. And like I said, the proof of the pudding is the US inflation rate is now about 4%. The Canadian inflation rate is about 3%. That's a very big difference. And that difference is accounted for by the difference in the tariffs, you know, among other things. And so far, the provinces and the federal government in Canada are in agreement in how to deal with Trump. And that's a pretty strong statement, because everyone's got their own opinions. One of the other things that bothers Trump a lot, so we were talking about, we were talking about the liquor. So let's talk about number two things, is the car manufacturing. So car manufacturing has always been a kind of a three-way trade between Mexico, Canada, and the US. So parts that are made in Canada might be installed in a car that's made in the States. Parts that are made in Mexico, parts that are made in Canada might be shipped to Mexico to put into a car that's assembled in Mexico and shipped back to the States. What is very true is the vast majority of cars in North America are sold in the United States. Because of that, Trump says, well, all the cars sold in the United States should be made in the United States. But that's not how the system works. The system works by trading among the three different countries. So what Trump did was he said, okay, I'm going to charge tariffs on any parts of the car that's, even if it's made in the US, I'm going to charge tariffs on the parts that are imported in order to make the car in the US. That's his system. So when he did that, Canada did exactly the opposite. It said, okay, for cars that are sold in Canada, what we're going to do is we're going to have an agreement that says that cars that are manufactured in the States, if they don't have Canadian parts in it, we're going to charge a tariff, or we're going to limit the number of cars coming into Canada on that basis. And Canada also announced that I'm sure you all heard of this, that we're going to allow 50,000 Chinese-made cars into Canada at a 6% tariff. Normally, the tariff on Chinese cars was 100%, just like it is in the US. we're going to allow 50,000 to come in and then going up to 70,000. So by doing that, you're opening up a Canadian market, and we're also exposing Americans to Chinese-made cars who may travel to the US, or Americans may travel to Canada and see these Chinese-made cars and see how good they are and how cheap they are. So this was a way of Canada to respond to the tariffs that put on Canadian cars. Now, that tariffs put on Canadian cars caused quite a bit of retraction in the Canadian car industry. So you had a plant closed down in Ontario, you had shifts cut, you had a whole assembly line transferred from Canada to the US, and this whole industry is centered in Ontario. And that's why Premier Ford is the angriest about this particular issue. And that's why he wants to hit back at the States very hard. What he wants to do, Ontario export and Quebec export electricity to the US on electric wires. They export electricity. He says, let's just cut off all the electricity to them. Let them generate their own electricity. That's a pretty strong step. Or let's tax the electricity at 25%. Let's say, okay, you want our electricity? You were paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Now you're going to pay 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour. The rest of it is, that balance is a tariff, is a tax that we're charging, an export tax. So Canada hasn't done that yet, but it's kind of like we'll call it a weapon in the pocket to threaten the US with. Needless to say, if you do this to Trump, he'll just double down and do something more and something worse. And among his other threats are that he would take away the pre-clearance, the US Customs pre-clearance, that we go to the airport and you pass through US Customs in the airport. So the flight between Canada and the US is a domestic flight. So Trump says, why should we give them that advantage? Let's just, take away all those inspectors and let them go through customs in the US. Of course, what that would mean is more burden on American customs in the US, but he just figures if Canada is benefiting, it's not a good thing for the US. That's the way he thinks. So that's his threat. So we talked about cars, we talked about alcohol. What's the third thing? Dairy products. So dairy products is something that really is getting Trump's goat. We know that Canada has what's called a supply management system. What that means is that we don't overproduce milk on dairy products. We set a price that the farmers are going to get, which enables them to have a good standard of living. And we don't allow the farmers to produce more than their quota, because we don't want to have excess dairy products on the market that will lower the price. So they're only allowed to produce a certain amount. They cannot produce more. If they do, they either have to spill it in the drain, or they have to pay a fine for overproducing. But they don't underproduce either. So they know that they are supplying the Canadian market well, and not more and not less. What that means, the only way the system can work is if Canada limits exports of dairy products. Because obviously, if you're paying our farmers X amount of dollars for their milk, and the American farmer can produce it at half the price, then that milk would get imported into Canada. And then, of course, the price would fall, and then Canadian dairy farmers would not have a market. So the only way to protect the supply management system is to limit the amount of imports of dairy products to Canada. And the way it works is that, first of all, we don't allow any liquid milk to be imported into Canada. And we allow 5% of dairy products of Canadian consumption to be imported into Canada. So in other words, if you take all the sales of cheese and things like that, 5% of it is the limit that we allow to come into the country. And what Trump doesn't like is that in that limit, there's more European dairy products that come in than American dairy products that come in. So he doesn't like that. He also doesn't like the fact that For the American products that come in, what happens is it's Canadian companies like Saputo who goes to the US, buys all this stuff, and brings it into Canada for themselves. So they're like the middleman, so they make that money and not the American cheese companies, we'll say, put it like that. So he doesn't like that at all. He wants to be free amount of trade, free trade in dairy products between Canada and the US. Now, as a consumer, I think that would be a great idea. Because if you guys go to the States and you look at the price of cheese in the States, or eggs, by the way, or chicken, those things are also covered by supply management. They're a lot cheaper in the States than they are here. And I thought that if we have free trade, that would lower our prices here of something that every person who, especially people who are poor, they need to spend money on dairy products, on eggs, on cheese and milk, and it would make all the prices less. On CBC Radio yesterday, there was an interview with with a Canadian dairy farmer named McKinnon from Quebec, from cote-saint-luc. And the first thing they said on the radio, we're going to have, I think his name was Neil McKinnon from cote-saint-luc come on the radio. So I said, oh, great, let me listen to him. What I wanted to hear was an accent, an English Quebec accent that was different from ours. But his accent was the same. I was kind of disappointed because I know people who live out in the valley, in Chateauguay Valley, and people who live out in the eastern townships, they do have a different accent in English than we have, but he himself didn't have one. So they asked the question, besides all the ones that we're talking about, they asked the question, what would you think would happen to prices if we had free trade in dairy products? And he says, don't think that the prices in Canada would go down, because what would happen is that the middleman, the stores and the wholesalers, they know that Quebecers are used to paying high prices for milk and cheese. They would just take that extra profit themselves, and there would be almost no change in the price to the consumer. Now, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. My thinking is it's partly true. But, of course, he was speaking on behalf of the Quebec dairy industry. By the way, you should know that Quebec produces 1/2 of all the milk produced in Canada and dairy products. So that's why it's so strong. That's why our Premier Frechette, she said yesterday, she's telling Carney, don't give in anything on the supply management system because it's essential to Quebec. Now, what is important to know is that the dairy industry, although there's not a lot of dairy farmers left in Canada, they are the anchors of the rural communities that they live in. So that means that, for every dairy farmer that is living in rural Canada, they support 4 or 5 other people, the tractor maintenance guys, the feed guys, all the other supplies that they need, fertilizer and everything else. So they are the anchor that supports the whole small rural community. And if they leave, if they're put out of business, kind of the whole rural community is not the same anymore, because that's the one anchor, that's the job, that's the money that's created in that rural community. So that was a point that he made, and I thought it was a very good point. So those are the 3 things that are bugging Trump about Canada. Somehow or other we've managed up until now with all the system that we do have, and he's the one who wants to try to upset it. And he loves Mexico a lot better than he loves Canada. Why? Why? I don't know. Why? I'll tell you one reason why. Because Mexico is a bridge between the US and South America and Central America. And if Mexico stops migrants from coming into the US border, that's doing the US a big service. Who the heck is coming from Canada into the US? Nobody, right? Also, drugs are coming from Mexico into the US. So if Mexico is there to stop the drugs, then that's doing the US a service. What service do we do to All we do is we give them cold weather, and now we're giving them smoke from the fires, which he blames Canada for having. He says, why doesn't Canada maintain their forests and rake up the brush? Rake up the brush, okay? I would like to give Mr. Trump a rake. Then what we do is we fly him into the middle of Quebec, where there is not a road within 500 kilometers. Just drop him down in the middle and say, here's a rake, start raking. Like he has no clue how many forests we have. He has no clue how empty this country is. 90% of Canadians live within 100 kilometers of the US border. What that means is the rest of it, except in Alberta, Alberta is the exception, with the exception of Alberta, pretty well everybody else lives within 100 kilometers of the US border, except, there are rural Saskatchewan, that's true, there is rural Manitoba, but I mean, in the numbers of people, we are a country, an urbanized country. We're a country where 80% of our population live in cities, and all those cities are located near the US border, except for Edmonton and Calgary. But if you think of it, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa, we're all within, those are the big four cities in the country. It's all within 100 miles of the US border. So that's him. Anyway, I'm going to leave, let me check my time. Good. I'm going to leave that aside. Any comments, questions? Yes, go ahead. No, I didn't say all. I didn't say all. What I said was, well, in terms of what, let's say? Absolutely correct. But remember, I said that in 8 out of 10 provinces, it's the government that owns the liquor system. The two that aren't are Saskatchewan and Alberta, which are also our more conservative provinces. America has not put, there is a tariff on Alberta oil going into the US, it's 10%. There is a tariff on Saskatchewan potash going into the US, it's 10%. He didn't raise that tariff, in this last little talk, because obviously it hurts Americans to pay all that, maple syrup is like not a vital there is tariff on maple syrup like everything else, but it's not as important to America as the oil or the potash that comes into the US. And the potash is especially important now that the Persian Gulf is closed. So all the fertilizer coming out of there, the nitrogen fertilizer, is not available. So potash, which is a second best, is now being used more and more. He's done some kind of nutty things, America has this rule about taking corn and turning it into ethanol that's mixed in with gasoline. And it used to be a limit of 10% of gasoline would have an alcohol content of 10%. But when you put that gas in your car, you get less gas mileage because it's not as efficient as gasoline. Mr. Trump has just raised that to 15%. So we're in a situation now, and I was reading this just the other day, 1/2 of all the corn grown in the US is now being put to fuel. So you think of all that corn that could be used to feed people, it could be used to feed animals, to feed people, it could be exported to corn-consuming countries in Latin America that don't have enough for themselves because of climate change and all that. No, he's got to have it turned into ethanol because then he pays good prices to the Iowa farmers, his favorite voters, to do that. So, to me, he keeps breaking boundaries on how bad a president could be, how many wrong decisions a president could make. Comes one after another. Yeah. With well, it's supposed to open on the 27th of July. So it took a long time to open because his friend owns the other toll bridge. So there is already a toll bridge between Windsor and Detroit. But the problem with that toll bridge is that A, it's overcrowded, and B, when you get off the bridge, you're right smack in the middle of Windsor, which is like a city. So there's no highway that you can go on. So they decided to build this other bridge called the Gordie Howe Bridge, of course, after the hockey player for Detroit, who's my favorite hockey player when I was a kid, by the way. And the owner of the first bridge lobbied and gave millions of dollars to Trump's campaign to delay the opening of the bridge. And the bridge was entirely paid by Canadians. And Trump was saying, well, he said that, you know, the Americans paid for the bridge and they used Canadian steel. That's not true, because they didn't pay for the bridge. They paid for the exit ramp, but not for the bridge itself. So he just tried to delay it as much as possible. And finally, they came to an agreement about how to share the tolls on the bridge. I don't know the details of it, but theoretically, Canada is supposed to get all the tolls until the bridge is paid for, and then they're supposed to split it 50-50. So I don't know if they made any changes in that formula or not. But it is supposed to be open finally this month. Yeah. Okay, so let me talk about Africa. Like I said, I was there. I did it was a cruise, and we started at the bottom. We went all the way up to the top and all the way out into Lisbon. So we stopped at many different places along the way. So let me ask you, what's so special about Africa? How is Africa unique in the world? What makes it so different from all the other continents? What's so special about it? Yeah. Yes, that's very true. It is the birthplace of human beings. In other words, yeah, of us. Yeah, the first remains of skeletons of human beings were found in Africa, in South Africa to be exact, in Tanzania to be exact, in Ethiopia to be exact. Those three places have the oldest remains of people, but not, I mean, we're not, when I say people, I mean, let's say our relatives, our ancestors, not people who look like us. But people who look like us were also first found in Africa. And according to what the scientists think, is that people like us, meaning Homo sapiens, our genus, only left Africa somewhere less than 100,000 years ago. Less than 100,000 years ago. And from leaving Africa, then spread all around the world pretty well. But up until 100,000 years ago, and they now believe there are two separate migrations of human beings out of Africa. One may have gone this way, and one may have gone that way. But that's at least what they think as they find more and more. And one of the biggest centers of archaeology of early human beings is actually in Israel. Because the first place you get to when you get out of Africa is Israel. And there's lots of caves there. People lived in caves, and so that's what they're excavating. So yes, it is the birthplace of our people, that's for sure. What makes it so different from everywhere else? Well, there's a few different things. First of all, this continent has 55 different countries. So that's a lot of countries. You think of Canada, the US, and Mexico, that's one continent with 3 countries. If you look at South America, maybe there's 12 countries, you know. Even Europe, which has lots of little countries, still has nowhere near 55 countries. And Asia, you know, which is the biggest continent, also the same thing. So there's a lot of countries. The other thing that distinguishes it is its poverty. So Africa is by far and away the poorest continent in the world. Now there's poor places outside of Africa, like Afghanistan, places like that. But all in all, Africa wins the championship of poverty in the whole world. Now, there's another thing that distinguishes Africa from the whole world, which I saw with my own two eyes. There are a lot of kids. The average age of the average African is 19 years old. That means half of the people are over 19 and half are under 19. Now, if you walk around the streets of Montreal, you could barely find kids or anybody under 19. The average age in Europe is somewhere in the 30s, where half are over the 30 and half are under 30, somewhere up in the middle 30s. Imagine the difference. Imagine what the future looks like. In Japan, it's 40. So half of Japanese are over 40 and half are under 40. So think of Africa when half are under 19 years old. What does that mean for the future? And of course, traveling there, the first thing I noticed, look at all these kids all over the place. You know, like they're everywhere. You know, here you see kids in the schoolyard. That's about it. There's kids are just all over the place. So you might ask yourself, is there a connection between poverty and having a lot of children? So, you know, you put two and two together, maybe there is a connection. And in fact, there is a connection. And the connection is, first of all, to say this, that the birth rate in Africa is definitely going down. Just the way it's gone down in the whole rest of the world is also going down in Africa. The countries in Africa that have the highest birth rate were Mali and Niger, up here, Mali and Niger. They used to have an average of 8 to 9 kids each woman. And now they're down to around the 5 or 6 per woman. So that's like a 50% drop, which is quite significant. Now, because they're poor, because there is no state welfare system, because there's no pension plan, because there's no support for people, especially any people, especially elderly people, the job of the children is to look after their parents. So the more children you have, the more you can share that task of looking after the parents. That's in the minds of every African from the time they're born. What's my most important job? To look after my parents. Now, you'd say to yourself, okay, but things are changing. You know, things are changing. Families are smaller. What happens when all these Africans move out to Europe, move to Montreal? Do they still look after their parents? And the answer is absolutely yes. That's in their DNA. So they send money home whether they're in Africa or not in Africa. The other special thing about Africa was up until recently, much more than half of the people didn't live in cities. So remember I was saying Canada, we have 80% living in cities. In Africa, back in 1950, or 1960, it was like 20%. People just lived their traditional lives. In this line here is the line between green and brown. So everything on top of this line is brown color, meaning it's like desert and semi-desert. Everything down below here is green, meaning forest and you know, more rainfall. This line also represents the division between Muslims living up this way and Christians living this way. So today in Africa, about 50-50, the line isn't exact, but about 50% of the people are Muslims and about 50% are Christians as a whole. Some countries, like here in Tanzania, it is exactly 50-50. Because this line here moves down when we get when we get to here, the line of Muslims moves down like this. And then you have a kind of an exception in Ethiopia over here, which is mostly Christians. But, you know, the Muslim population is increasing faster than the Christian population, but they're both increasing very, very quickly because of all the children that they have. So If you think of it like this, Asia, South America, Europe, North America, all these places have fewer than 2 children per woman. That means that if you project it in the long term, the population is going to go down everywhere. It's going to go down first in East Asia, meaning Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, where else? China, even. Those countries have way under 2 children per woman, and their populations are dropping already. China itself has lost 1 million people in population for a year for the last 3 years. Well, what's 1 million people? Nothing for them because the population is 1.4 billion. But that's the long-term trend, is population going down. Europe, some of the countries are, especially in Eastern Europe, the birth rates are really, really low. But there is no country in Europe that has a birth rate of over 2.1 per woman, and that's the stabilization rate. So they have no, and Canada and the US, exactly the same thing. South America, exactly the same thing. So where are all the young workers going to come from if we need workers to do stuff? There's only one place that has an excess of workers. That's in Africa. So, 1 or 2 generations from now, the demand for these people is going to be very high because there's going to be nobody left to milk the cows at 4 in the morning. There's going to be nobody left to cut the bushes, nobody left to harvest the crops in Europe and everywhere else. Nowhere else to work in the factories. We have factories here in Quebec. We're not talking about picking turnips out in St. Isidore in the sun. We're talking about working in a factory job. The owners of the factories in Quebec says we have no workers. We have to import workers from Mexico to keep our factory open. That's the situation of today. So imagine, multiply it out a few more generations, and you could see how worse the situation is going to become. So let me talk about the poverty in Africa. Let me just check my time. Oh, it's so good. I love that sound. So I visited a country called Gambia, right over there. Tiny little country. And you got to turn. So in Gambia, it was the poorest place that I've been to. We must have stopped in about 14 different countries. Gambia was the poorest. Their per capita income per year is $950. That means per year, that's what the people are making. Now, cars, gasoline, television sets, and other stuff are not cheaper in Gambia because they don't make the money. Those stuff is all imported from Korea or China or Japan. They charge one price for all the stuff they're selling. So how is somebody making $940 a year supposed to live? And the answer is very poorly. They live in poor housing. The food that they buy is just locally grown. And they just manage the best way they can. So it's very poor. Now, because of an excess of people, if they send somebody to Europe and that somebody sends back 1/3 of their wages, that's the money that makes these countries actually be able to survive, because they can't survive on what they have there. Now let's look at the natural resources. Africa has tons of natural resources. They have great agriculture going up to here. They have minerals, in some cases, minerals that nobody else has. In the Congo, of all places, here. In the Congo, they have cobalt, they have minerals, they have, some of the rare earths that everybody wants to have, copper, tons of copper, gold. You know, there was a country called Gold Coast, now called Ghana, because they called it Gold Coast because there was gold there. Um, there's oil, all kinds of oil, all kinds of oil production over here. Nigeria over here has oil production over here. There's gas fields off the coast of Mozambique that are just being done. You have the Suez Canal for Egypt, which is a kind of a resource of the canal going over there. Lots of natural resources, let's put it like that. And yet the countries are so poor. So there's two explanations, and I want to focus on both of them, but especially on the second one, because that's what I got to see with my own eyes. So the first explanation is this, that until the 1960s, almost all of Africa, with tiny exceptions of Liberia and Ethiopia, were run and owned by colonial powers. So who are the colonial powers that had possessions in Africa? Great Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Portugal. Those are the main ones. Certainly Britain, France, Portugal, they had a lot of big ones. Belgium had the Congo, Italy had Libya, and Spain had a few little pieces here and there along the coast. So all these countries then owned Africa by the 1800s. The whole entire continent was captured by these European powers. What did these European powers do? They took stuff out of Africa, right? That's what they wanted. They needed to run the place. They had to make money. So they're the ones who own the mines. They're the ones who own the agricultural plantations. They're the ones who exploited the African economy for their benefit. And of course, they sold to Africa stuff that they made in those countries in order to have a market for their goods. But mainly, that was the system. That was the exploitation system. Not only that, but that I said there's 55 countries in Africa, 55. Like, how did the borders get solved? How did the borders get made? Who made those borders? The Europeans made the borders. So the Europeans made the borders. Did they look at who's living in Africa and ask them, what country do you want to be in? No. They just put lines wherever they wanted to. So by putting lines wherever you wanted to, you could have some people living on one side in one country, the same people on the other side living in a different country. Or you could have, traditional enemies squeezed together in one place when they could have made the border in a different way. So it's logical that with these borders, you're going to have political strife after independence, because the borders were drawn almost with a ruler, in many cases in a straight line. And the people on each side of the border were like just put in different places with no input of their own. So it's natural that you're going to have strife in Africa. So we've had civil wars. We have civil wars. Sudan. Sudan was actually recently divided into two countries, Sudan and South Sudan, after 25 years of fighting between the Muslims in the north and the Christians in the south. Morocco and Algeria, they're fighting themselves over the Sahara enclave that used to belong to Spain, that Morocco took over, and Algeria says, well, we think we should have something to do with it. Ethiopia and Eritrea over here. The Italians took over Eritrea a long time ago, and then they said, oh, let's add Ethiopia to our collection. So they started a war with Ethiopia that they lost. The first time a European country lost the war to an African country was this 1896 war over here between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But at one point, Ethiopia and Eritrea were united in one country. Then Eritrea separated, and Ethiopia says, well, now we have no coastline, so we want somehow to take over Eritrea in that way, you know? Somalia, further, Somalia further out, map's not exact, but Somalia here was owned by the Italians when it was divided into three parts. In colonial days, you had Italian Somaliland, British Somaliland, and French Somaliland. Three different Somalilands, all under different colonial powers. So the British and the Italian united into a country called Somalia. The French became the country called Djibouti. And now the British Somalia seceded from regular Somalia. They changed their name to Somaliland, and they have one country in the world that recognizes this new country called Somaliland. Which is that one country in the world? Israel, correct. Imagine Israel, the one and only country that recognizes this new country called Somalia over here. And so that's one example over there. Here, Rwanda and Burundi were two Belgian colonies that have the same people living there. So of course they made two colonies with the same people, so they end up fighting with each other. And within Rwanda, you have two populations, the Tutsis and the Hutus, and that's where the genocide of the Tutsi people took place. 400,000 people were murdered and massacred in something like 4 months. The rate of killing of people was higher than the rate of killing Jews in the Second World War, because they only lasted for 4 months, but they killed 500,000 people in 4 months. So that's over there. What other wars do we have here? Oh, plenty of them. The wars of independence, of course, there were plenty. So it just gives you an idea of the instability. One of the first ingredients for economic failure is a civil war or war of any kind. And that's something that the president should think about. President T, I'm talking about. He already spent, he said, $38 billion on the war in Iran. What did he get for $38 billion that the taxpayers have to pay? He got nothing. He got the closed Straits of Hormuz and gas prices that are $1 a gallon more than when he started. So civil wars and wars between countries are very destructive to the environment and to the economy, and Africa has had plenty of them. But I want to mention something else, and that's what I got to see. I got to see with my own two eyes here and up here, which is the slave trade. Okay, so we know that slaves were shipped from Africa to North and South America for a long time. How many slaves were shipped? Of course, we don't know exactly for sure. We have a good idea. Somewhere around 5 million. Okay. Now, the slaves, where did they come from? They came a lot from West Africa, this whole region here. Okay. A lot from Angola, this region down in this area over here, this region here. And some from East Africa, but they didn't get very often to North America, but there was a slave trade in East Africa going to the Arab countries, to the Gulf states. How many? I said around 5 million. How long did the slave trade last? Around somewhere, we'll call it from the late 1500s up until 1834 or so. Somewhere like that. So you're talking now 16, 17, almost 300 years, 275 years worth of trade of slaves going to North America and South America. More went to Caribbean and South America than North America. somewhere around 400,000 slaves were shipped to the US, around that number. Somewhere around 2 million were shipped to the Caribbean, Jamaica, the islands, Haiti, all that, and then to Brazil. Brazil was the last country that outlawed slavery in 1888, believe it or not, that late. So how did the slaves get to America? It was Africans. First of all, before we go there, we'll say this, that it was the Portuguese who were the first ones who came from Portugal all along the coast here, and they just stopped in different places, set up trading posts where along the coast, and in these trading posts, what they did was they traded goods to the Africans. Whatever the Africans had to sell, whatever the Portuguese had to sell, they were exchanged at these trading posts. Not slaves, but just that's how they started. Eventually, once the America and the Caribbean were discovered and developed, that's where the demand for slaves took place. What did the slaves do in America? They grew sugar. Sugar in the 1700s was worth a fortune. And I mean a real fortune. And you need a lot of work to grow sugar, to plant, to harvest, to crush. It's a hand job. Remember, no tractors in those days, no crushers in those days. It was strictly a hand job of working 12 hours a day, cutting sugar cane, getting your hands all cut up, loading the sugar cane onto wagons pulled by horses and donkeys, bringing them to the mill where they would be crushed and where the sugar would come out. So that's the main thing that they grew. Now in the US, it was cotton and tobacco, but at the beginning, sugar was the item in the West Indies and in South America. So when you had wars between these different African tribes, the tribes that lost the war had their men seized and women and brought down in chains to these ports where they were loaded on ships and brought to America. So there was a three-way trade. They call it the triangular trade. I'm gonna, how am I gonna do this? Let's make a triangle like this. Okay, so this is America and South America. This is Europe. This is Africa. Okay, ships came with stuff to sell to Africa. Mirrors, scissors, metal, knives, guns, fancy cloth, stuff like that. That was brought here to Africa, to these posts. In Africa, they took the slaves, they shipped the slaves to America. America, they grew the sugar, the cotton, which went back to Europe. So the triangular trade was going like this here for 200 years. The same ships, you know. It's easy to sail down the coast of Africa. You cannot cross from Europe to America this way by ship. It's too windy. You're going against the wind. You have to go down here in Africa. Then you could cross this way and come to the Caribbean and come to America. And that's how you do it, because the winds are pushing you. Then when you want to come back from America, you go up the coast and then the winds will push you back to Europe. Remember, they had sailing ships, no motors. So this was the trade. Now, what was made clear to us there was, imagine the slaves that they took were not a room full of people like me and all you guys. These were all 16 and 20-year-olds people, the strongest people in their society, right? The strongest ones, the ones who did all the work. So imagine if you take away 3 million people of your best and brightest, who's left, right? Who's left? The families are broken. So the families are broken. They have to move. They have to live in fear. So that is continued, this advantage is continued through the generations up until now. And, you know, when you look at the slaves that came to America and you look at the NBA, National Basketball Association, you look at the NFL, National Football Association, you say, how come they're all black? Look at the French soccer team. You saw in the World Cup, French soccer team, like they were 95% black. How come? Well, you took the strongest and the best people out of Africa. And of course, they, you know, continue mating with each other wherever they go. And that's what you're going to get. They weren't random people that they picked off the street. Because why? A strong slave is worth 5 times more than a little weakling. So if you have one room in your ship to ship a slave, you want to pick the best quality. You don't want to pick just anybody. So this reinforcing aspect kind of explains in some way or other the disadvantage that Africa is suffering these days. And I visited slave castles, they call them. They were prisons where they kept these slaves in dungeons waiting for a ship to come to pick them up. And it was awful conditions. And the ships packed these slaves like sardines. And you say, why would you want to do that? This is your goods. Don't you want to deliver good goods at the end? And the answer was that the slaves were so cheap that if they lost somewhere around 10 or 20% of the slaves died on the way over. They just dumped them overboard. They just went back and got more. So that was the way the system worked for all those years. Okay, so 3 o'clock. Questions, comments, anything you like about Africa, about anything at all that you want to speak about. It was, you know, it was so heartwarming to see. We were in Ghana, which was the first independent African country in the wave of African countries. There were 2 big slave prisons there. And Barack Obama and his wife, Michelle, they visited one and they put up a plaque. And you have a lot of American blacks who are coming there and, you know, paying respects to that place, putting down all kinds of mementos and tokens and things like that. And for an American black person to go back to there, like people were saying, that was their Auschwitz. Once you got into that slave castle, you were not going out. You were not coming back to Africa. You were sent to wherever you were sent to, Jamaica, Haiti, Louisiana, Brazil, Colombia, any of these places. You lost all ties to your homeland. It's like you were erased completely from the history of the families that you were taken from. So that's what I'm saying. It was really very poignant to visit that and to understand the effect that it had on future generations, that these people were all taken. And of course, it was Africans themselves who sold them. It wasn't like the Portuguese or the British went into the countryside to find slaves. They couldn't be bothered. They just waited in the ships till the Africans brought the slaves to them. So that's how that went. Yes, madame. Diamonds. Unfortunately, I'll tell you, I'm going to mention something about diamonds. We have in Canada, we had 2 big diamond companies in the Northwest Territories, the Ekati mine and the Diavik mine. They both just closed. You know why? Diamonds are not worth anything. Diamonds are worth bupkis because they're making them themselves. Yeah. Diamonds were found in Botswana down here, Namibia, Botswana. Those are the 2 places. A little bit in South Africa down here, a little bit in the Congo as well. But the diamond business is not a forward-looking business. It is not. And plus, as we all know, people aren't getting married these days. We just have to look at more than half of Quebec couples are not married. You know that. The diamonds are not expensive because they make them artificially. They're virtually the same as the real ones. So there is something called the conflict diamonds. These were diamonds that were mined, especially here in Sierra Leone, this country down over here. And, you know, they're fought over by different gangs and they enslave people to work in the mines. And they say, you know, unless you come up with so many diamonds, we're not letting you out of the mine. It's just really very brutal. But that industry has seen better days. We'll put it like that. Copper, yes. There is lots. The copper in Africa is found in Zambia, which is down here, and especially in this corner of the Congo, in this corner here, in Zambia, and those are the two big copper places. They also opened up in Guinea over here, the world's largest iron ore deposit. It is so huge. There is so much iron ore. It's as if an entire mountain is made out of iron ore. And they just built a railway to the coast, and they just had the first shipment of iron ore from Guinea, from that mine, Simandou is the name of it, to the coast to, you know, to go. But iron ore is not a valuable commodity, unfortunately. Some, yeah, I'll tell you, maybe we'll finish up by, where is money coming into Africa? Where is it coming from? There's one answer. I'm giving you a chance. One answer. You got the right answer. China. China, China, China. In Abidjan, the capital of Ivory Coast. And by the way, the Ivory Coast and its neighbor Ghana, they produce over 80% of the world's chocolate cocoa beans. And the demand for chocolate is not going down, unlike diamonds. People are still, they'd rather have a chocolate than a diamond. So that is, and in a way, fortunately, the cocoa industry, the growing of chocolate, is done by all small farmers. There's no huge plantations there that were in the hands of the colonial powers. Like in Kenya, they had the tea and coffee plantations in Kenya and in Tanzania. But over there, they were all small farmers. You know what's so crazy? That these small farmers who grow all this cocoa beans, you know what their biggest problem is? They can't get workers. With all those 19-year-olds, they can't get enough workers to pick the stuff because it's hard work to pick cocoa all day long. So I was talking about something else besides cocoa. What was it now? Copper, iron. What were you asking me? Oh, China. That's what I was saying. China. So I was saying in Abidjan, the capital of the Ivory Coast, they are building a 75-story building. The Chinese are building it. It's there. I see it. And the cranes are like, you say, what? You know, in the middle here of poor Africa, they're putting up a 75-story building. The Chinese have built ports. The Chinese have built railways. The Chinese have built factories. The Chinese are putting and have put, I won't say are putting, they have put billions of dollars into Africa. They put so much money in, but then they realize, well, wait a minute. We thought we'd be able to get the money out fast, but they don't. They can't, because African workers are not Chinese workers. They in a way sort of bit off more than they could chew in that sense. But they're still coming in. You see all over Africa, Chinese people, Chinese stores, Chinese companies. Like all of a sudden, every single place that we visited had what's called a China Mart. China Mart means a huge warehouse, like a Costco, and where they sell Chinese products there. And Chinese people are the ones who own it and work in those places. So they are really, their footprint is all over there. In the olden days, it was Lebanese Lebanese people from Lebanon who opened up stores and businesses and dealerships and all that all over West Africa here, especially in West Africa. Our chief of police of Montreal, he's from the Ivory Coast, Lebanese, but from the Ivory Coast. And I was saying this the other day, Trump's daughter's husband's father, he's another one. He had a car dealership that went bankrupt, by the way, also in West Africa over here. So there were a lot of long history of Lebanese people, mostly Christian Lebanese, who settled along these places here. And maybe I'll just finish with you by telling you one interesting story. We visited islands here called Saint Thomé, little island over there. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's an independent African country today called Saint Thomé and Principe. It was a Portuguese colony along with the big ones, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea. Those were the big ones. But they also had smaller ones, the Saint Thomé. And when the Jews were kicked out of Portugal in 1497, there were some that stayed, and eventually the government caught up with them. And what they did was they sent 500 children. They took the children away from the parents, and they sent 500 of these teenagers, children, and young people to Saint Thomé Island to do something there, to get rid of them from Portugal, let them do something in Saint Thomé. These people eventually, many died because conditions, remember, you're talking about yellow fever, malaria, typhoid fever, the full gamut of diseases that Europeans didn't have, they have them there in Africa. The ones that survived intermarried with local people, and they became a kind of a group. And eventually, of course, the Inquisition came there and kicked them out of Saint Thomé. So they were called lanzados. Lanzado, like lancer in French, to throw something. They were thrown out of Saint Thomé, and they ended up settling in Gabon over here, and all the way down into the Congo along the coast. And these people were mulattoes. They were mixed white and Africans, but speaking Portuguese. So up until the 1700s, when explorers came there, they said, oh, you know what? There's this group of these Portuguese-speaking people who were Jewish, and they're running businesses along the coastline. So eventually they disappeared. Eventually they assimilated and disappeared. But it was an interesting story to hear about, having to do with Saint Thomé. And the people who live in Saint Thomé know that they once had this group of people living on that island. Also very, very poor, a real dump. When we spent a whole day there, it was pretty sad. See, you see they had fishing boats that were made out of one tree. Imagine you cut a tree down, you cut it in half, you scoop out the inside, that's your boat. Just a plain wooden tree as a boat that they stick a motor on. And that's how they went out fishing. And the problem is that the Chinese have all kinds of huge factory ships that go all the way around here, scoop up all the fish, and then there's nothing left for the little guys to go out a few miles. There's nothing left at all for them. And then the Chinese, they register their boats in Ghana so that they're considered a local industry, so they're allowed to fish within 12 miles of the shore. So, they have a tough life, these people. They really do. So anyway, that's it. I want to thank you so much. Any questions? Any future topic, any topic that you would like me to discuss, I'll be glad to do it. Just tell me, and I'll look up some information and I'll speak to you about it. About Ethiopian Jews, there's just about none left in Ethiopia. They've all been taken to Israel. Some of them have gone back to Ethiopia to run businesses. Like, in other words, they're like business people using the contacts that they have in Israel to run businesses in Ethiopia. And of course, there are some descendants of Jews who were converted to Christianity in the olden days, who are still living in Ethiopia and who want to go to Israel, but the Israeli government is saying we've had enough of that. So, they're not rushing to take them in. But they're related to the ones who are already in Israel. Israel has about 150,000 Ethiopian Jews living there now. That's the story about that. And by the way, Ethiopia is really one of the countries, although poor, has come up the most. And Ethiopian Airlines is one of the very, very few African airlines which are certified to travel to Europe. They have tons of airlines in Africa. They wouldn't allow them anywhere near a European airport. But Ethiopian Airlines, their standards are so high that they're allowed to fly to Europe. Okay, so thanks again.